Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Peter Abelard. He's a medieval thinker who was as controversial as he was brilliant. Now, you might know a little bit about philosophy, but trust me, even in that world, Abelard, he really stands out.
That's true. It wasn't just his ideas, but his life was like a whirlwind of drama and love affairs and some really serious intellectual showdowns. We're talking castration and feuds with powerful church figures. Abelard's life was definitely not boring.
We've got some great material from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for this deep dive, and paints this picture of a guy who was not just a philosopher. He was also a theologian, a poet, a musician, and a sharp logician, almost like a medieval Renaissance man.
Yeah, he was born in 1079 in Brittany, and he gave up a comfortable life to pursue knowledge. He traveled all over studying with some of the biggest names of the time, people like Roscelin and William of Champeaux.
But he didn't just study with them, did he? He pretty much showed up and started winning all the debates. I can imagine that didn't make him very popular with everyone. Some accounts even say that he was never actually defeated in an argument, which probably added to his reputation for, well, let's just say, confidence.
He definitely wasn't afraid of intellectual sparring. That sharp mind also landed him in hot water, especially when he had this scandalous affair with one of his students, Heloise. The punishment was, well, it was drastic.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. He was castrated. Definitely not your typical philosophy classroom drama. But even after that, Abelard kept on teaching, moving to a monastery. And he continued to challenge traditional thinking and ruffled more than a few feathers along the way.
There's this definite streak of defiance in Abelard. It's really evident in his work. He questioned some of the most fundamental assumptions of his time, like the nature of universals. This was a huge deal back then.
Right, universals. Most philosophers of his day were realists. They thought concepts like humanity existed independently of actual individual humans, like these abstract forms were floating out there defining everything.
Exactly, but Abelard wasn't buying it. He argued that universals are just words. He called them noumena. It's called nominalism, or maybe more accurately, irrealism. Think of it like this. The word unicorn. You understand it, but there's no actual unicorn running around. Abelard believed many philosophical concepts were like that, useful words, but not things in themselves.
So instead of focusing on this abstract realm, Abelard was much more grounded in the concrete, observable world. It's kind of what makes his ideas feel surprisingly modern even today.
He was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He applied this idea of irrealism pretty broadly, beyond just universals. For him, things like propositions, events, even time itself outside the present moment, these weren't independent entities. They stem from concrete individuals and our experiences.
That's fascinating. So if concepts are just words, how do we make sense of them? This must be where his work on logic and language comes in.
Absolutely. Abelard was a master of logic. He built this sophisticated system based on truth and falsity, focusing on how one statement can logically lead to another, not just based on its form, but on its content. We call this entailment. I can give you an example. The statement, all humans are mortal, that logically leads to, if Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. The second truth is guaranteed by the first, even though it's not directly stated.
So even if I don't explicitly say that Socrates is mortal, if we agree that all humans are, and we agree that Socrates is human, then we have to accept that Socrates is mortal.
Precisely. Abelard's logic was all about understanding these relationships between statements. And this was centuries before modern logicians were grappling with similar ideas.
I can see how his logic ties into his irrealism. If concepts are fundamentally words, then we need a powerful way to analyze how those words relate to each other, how they actually build meaning.
You got it. And Abelard didn't stop there. He was deeply interested in the subtle ways language works. He knew that the same sentence could have completely different meanings depending on the context. It could be a statement or a question, even a command. He even developed this theory of signification, exploring how words actually point to things in the world and hold meaning in our minds.
So we're talking about someone who connects language, logic, and how we perceive the world, all with this surprisingly modern perspective. It's like he's laying the groundwork for philosophers centuries later.
It really is, and it even goes deeper than that. His work on the philosophy of mind is also revolutionary. He tackled this really tough question, how our thoughts relate to the physical world. And he rejected some really big theories of the time, like the conformality theory.
For those who are new to this, the conformality theory suggests that our minds sort of take on the shape of the object that we're thinking about, like having a mental cookie cutter.
Right. And Abelard argued this was nonsense. He pointed out that if our minds took on the properties of objects, then thinking about a tall building would make our minds tall. We know that's not how thinking works. But he also rejected another theory, the resemblance theory.
That's the one where we have these little mental pictures that resemble the things we see, right? It seems kind of intuitive at first.
It does. But Abelard argued that mental pictures are like paintings, they need to be interpreted. You can look at a painting of a tree and just see colors, or you can see a representation of a tree. The picture itself doesn't tell you how to understand it.
So just because I have a mental image of, let's say, a cat, doesn't automatically mean that I'm thinking about cat. That image could mean feline or pet, even allergy. It needs more context.
Exactly. What he's getting at is that the aboutness of thought, what philosophers call intentionality, it can't be explained simply by having these mental pictures. There's a cognitive act involved, the deliberate directing of our attention. And that's where his adverbial theory comes in. Our thoughts are like actions. They're directed towards things, not passive copies of them. You can think of it like an arrow flying toward a target. The arrow itself isn't the target, but it's moving toward it. Similarly, our thoughts aren't the objects themselves, but they're directed towards those objects.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. But how does his theory of language fit into this picture? It seems like he's suggesting that our thoughts are structured like language.
He is. Abelard believed that we actually think in language even when we're not speaking. The way words relate to each other in a sentence reflects the way concepts are organized in our minds.
So he's not just a nominalist, but he's also suggesting that the structure of language shapes how we think.
That's a really sharp observation, and it's a debate that still goes on today. But for Abelard, this idea had some really profound implications, especially when you consider his views on ethics.
Right, because if our thoughts are structured by language, and morality is all about intention, then understanding the logic of language becomes super important for understanding morality.
Exactly. For Abelard, clear thinking leads to clear intentions, which then leads to moral action. And that clarity of thought, well, it comes from logic and language.
So his focus on the golden rule takes on a whole new meaning. It's not just this nice saying. It becomes this logical principle that can actually guide our actions.
That's right. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you becomes a principle of reciprocity, of understanding that we actually share this common humanity with others. And for Abelard, that understanding, it comes from reason, not just emotion.
But hold on, if our thoughts are formed by language, and language is something that we create, wouldn't that mean that morality is relative? I mean, different cultures have different languages, different ways of thinking.
That's a great question. It really gets to the core of this long-standing debate in philosophy. Is morality relative or is it universal? Abelard would likely argue that even though specific moral rules might differ across cultures, the underlying principles of reason, those are universal. The golden rule, he'd say, is something that any rational being can understand, no matter their language or culture.
It's like he's looking for that common thread, that shared space where reason and faith, language and ethics can all come together.
Absolutely. That's what makes his work so challenging and so compelling. He wasn't afraid to grapple with these big questions, even when the answers led him into some pretty risky territory.
And speaking of risky territory, we can't avoid talking about his famous love affair with Heloise.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a scandal, it was this major turning point in his life. It might have even shaped his views on love, sin, and desire.
Yes. The relationship between Abelard and Heloise, it was more than just a forbidden romance. It became this philosophical and theological puzzle that he grappled with for the rest of his life.
Their letters are incredible. They're full of passion, intellectual sparring, and this deep yearning for connection, even after they were forced apart. It makes you wonder, how did Abelard reconcile those really intense feelings with his commitment to reason and his beliefs about sin?
It's a tough question. Remember, this is the guy who argued that actions themselves are morally neutral. It's the intention behind them that matters.
Right. So was his love for Heloise sinful? It sounds like he was trying to apply his own ethical framework to his own life. Maybe it wasn't such an easy fit.
It's complex. He seems to suggest that it wasn't the love itself that was wrong, but the circumstances surrounding it. The secrecy, the betrayal of trust.
So he's acknowledging that human passion is powerful, that desire is complicated, and that even the brightest minds can get caught in situations that defy these easy moral categories.
Exactly. And it brings us back to Abelard's idea that we should always try to act according to our conscience, even when that conscience isn't perfect, even when it leads us into difficult and even painful situations.
This part of his story, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just abstract philosophy for Abelard. These were real lives, real emotions, and the messy reality of being human. Abelard's life really embodied that complexity.
It did. So let's turn our attention to this crucial chapter in Abelard's life. Maybe it can shed some light on his larger philosophical project.
So we've talked about Abelard's groundbreaking ideas, his very dramatic life. But to really grasp the man, I think we have to talk about Heloise. Their love affair wasn't just, some bit of medieval gossip. It fundamentally changed him.
Yeah, it did. And it's important to remember that Heloise, she was brilliant in her own right. Abelard was her tutor. And that intellectual spark, well, it ignited a passionate romance. And as we know, things didn't exactly end well.
No, not at all. I mean, we're talking about a time when a relationship between a teacher and a student wasn't just taboo, it was actually dangerous. Heloise's uncle, Fulbert, he was enraged, and he had Abelard castrated.
It was a brutal act. It forced Abelard into a monastery and Heloise to become a nun. It's easy to just see this as the tragic ending to their love story.
But it wasn't the end, was it? I mean, their letters show us that their connection, it continued, even though it took on this very different form.
Right, and those letters are so fascinating from a philosophical perspective. We see Abelard grappling with his guilt, with the nature of desire, and this conflict between earthly love and his spiritual commitments.
It's almost like he's applying his own ethical framework to his own life and finding that it doesn't quite fit, right?
Yeah.
He argued that actions were morally neutral. It was the intention that mattered.
Right. So was his love for Heloise a sin?
Hmm.
Abelard seems to be suggesting that it wasn't the love itself that was wrong, but the circumstances, the secrecy, the broken trust, that made it wrong.
It's a really nuanced view. He's acknowledging the power of passion, the complexity of human desire, and the fact that even, the most brilliant minds can make decisions that defy these easy moral categories.
Wow.
Exactly. And it brings us back to Abelard's idea that we should strive to act in accordance with our conscience, even when our conscience isn't perfect, even when it leads us to difficult places.
So what can we learn from this medieval philosopher? A genius, but clearly a flawed human being, just like all of us. What does it all mean?
Well, I think Abelard reminds us that philosophy isn't just some abstract game. It's about grappling with the most fundamental questions of what it means to exist. Love, loss, morality, faith, the nature of reality itself.
And he shows us that there aren't always these clear-cut answers. Life is messy, and sometimes the best we can do is just try to have clear intentions and act in a way that aligns with what we believe is right and learn from our mistakes.
Exactly. And sometimes those mistakes can be huge life-altering events. Abelard's life shows us that even when we face those mistakes, we can keep questioning, keep learning, and keep growing.
He encourages us to think for ourselves, to use reason, but also to acknowledge the limits of reason, the power of our emotions, and the mystery that lies at the heart of human experience.
And maybe most importantly, he reminds us that even a philosopher who was condemned by the church and castrated can still impact the world centuries after his death.
It's a powerful legacy. And for those of you who are intrigued by this fascinating and complex figure, I really encourage you to explore Abelard's work further. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great place to start, but don't stop there. Read his writings, his letters, the debates that he inspired, and see what resonates with you.
You might be surprised how relevant his ideas feel, even in our very modern world. And maybe you'll even find yourself asking some of the same questions that haunted Abelard. What does it mean to live a good life? What is the nature of love? How can we use reason to navigate faith and the complexities of, well, simply being human?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Peter Abelard. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.